You so much for being here this morning. Uh, he is an associate professor at Hofstra University. Actually, before I get started, let me just do a couple of housekeeping items first. Just as a heads up, as always, this will be recorded. So after the conclusion of the webinar, we'll have this uploaded to our Eastern Region Science Sharing webinar Google site page. If you have any questions throughout the course of the webinar, please feel free to throw them in chat, or we can have I'm sure we can have a brief Q&A session after the conclusion of the presentation. And with that said, to also improve bandwidth, please ask that you keep your cameras off, except for, of course, Jase, who's presenting this morning. And with that, we will get started with the introduction. So Dr. Bernhardt is an associate professor at Hofstra University right here on Long Island. Some of his recent research includes several projects related to weather risk communication, including using virtual reality in various research aspects. So that's been funded by a number of agencies, including a recent New York Sea grant, NSF UCAR, etc. Jase has also earned a bachelor in atmospheric science from Cornell before proceeding for his master's and PhD in geography from Penn State University. In turning to this morning's conversation, in recent years, NOAA agencies have increased the availability of weather products available in languages besides just English. This has included the development of rip current outreach products in Spanish. And because rip currents are one of the leading causes of fatalities for coastal WFOs, as well as still being a threat in the Great Lakes region as well, this is an imperative topic that needs to be discussed and that is of interest to many across Eastern region and beyond. This morning, Jase will discuss research evaluating the efficacy of the NWS Spanish rip current safety brochure available online, which he'll be discussing, as well as the results of a summer 22 survey, which addressed some of these issues, mainly due to the complexity of translation of various terminology into different languages. With that said, Jase, welcome you to the next Eastern Region Science Sharing webinar series. Thank you so much, and you have the floor, sir.
All right, thank you, Jordan, for the introduction and for inviting me, and thanks especially to Nelson and Dave, who have been such great partners, of course, at the OKX office. So I'm going to go ahead and get my screen sharing going to begin the presentation. And thanks for all attending this morning or watching the video later on. So as noted, this will be looking at improving local and regional rip current communication in languages other than English. And as mentioned, I'm Jase Bernhardt from Hofstra University. Okay, so I know this is a review for everyone, but one huge piece of motivation is the fact that rip currents are among the deadliest weather hazards nationally. Something that maybe kind of slips notice oftentimes. Certainly, in the sort of national media beyond meteorologists and the public consciousness, rip currents are not covered extensively and not associated with danger. Despite the fact that on our chart on the left here, we see that rip currents on average in the past decade, there are 69 fatalities per year. That does actually place it at number 3 after heat and floods. And of course, on average in the last decade, higher than the much more renowned severe weather events like hurricanes and tornadoes, lightning. So this is a problem, of course, across coastal zones in the U.S. And of note, in a place like New York, you see on the right, it is, of course, not just the Atlantic beaches, but also the Great Lakes have tides and rip currents, of course, as well. So this recent image from 2020 showed at least 5 rip current fatalities in New York State. And OKX prepared this graph a couple years ago. You see dotting the shore, the South Shore of Long Island, really all the state parks just in this one summer. At least the many key ones had rip-related fatalities, and then even a few on Lake Ontario as well. So clearly, this is a event that can unfortunately lead to poor outcomes for individuals. And most distressingly, there should, of course, be 0 fatalities from rip currents. There's no reason why rip currents should kill anyone. So these are all very preventable. As we know, some of these other hazards are a bit more complicated. The warning aspects and the actions people should best take, and there's more societal factors and things. But rip currents, while there are those considerations with communication, certainly it should be 0, this chart here. And then specifically looking at one of the issues surrounding weather outreach and morning communication that has been identified in recent years, and of course applies to rip currents like everything else, is the idea that we need to consider translating our products and warnings to languages beyond English. And of course, Spanish is perhaps the language of most urgency, being the next most spoken language in the country. And of course, in the OKX, WFO, CWA, a very commonly spoken language, and one that for many folks in the area, it's perhaps their only language they're fluent in, or the primary language they're fluent in. And NWS has been making great strides with the translation of weather products into Spanish. And for example, through work with the NWS Spanish outreach team and multimedia assistance and Spanish team, and great website, the Spanish section of the Weather Ready Nation page, and some really great collaboration with Spanish-speaking broadcast Mets. And this is all great, but of course, with any relatively new initiative, there are issues that still exist, and then those, of course, create barriers and can make it more likely for folks that don't speak English, perhaps, to be caught up in a hazard and be in danger from it, with rip currents being the example. In this case, some of the issues that we're going to know about in this work is exploring are things like technical jargon being translated to another language, idioms, and just in general, the lack of precision that is natural when transitioning from one language to another. So the NWS and NOAA has recently developed a rip current safety toolkit, and much of those products have been translated into Spanish. For example, there's a beach sign, nice infographic, initially in English, of course, translated into Spanish. And that's shown on the image on the right. A slightly larger safety poster that can also be posted around a beach, or bulletin board sort of thing that again has been translated. And finally, the focus of this study was actually a full 2-page brochure that includes this infographic on the right and lots of other helpful information and facts about rip currents and how they form and what they look like and what one should do if caught in one. So that 2-page brochure was the focus of this research in terms of evaluating how it's working so far, specifically the Spanish language translation. So this study had 2 research questions and related hypotheses. So first of all, what are the limitations of this relatively recently translated into Spanish NOAA rip current outreach brochure? This again is 2-page front and back brochure, initially in English translated to Spanish. And the hypothesis, of course not earth-shattering, is that yes, there were likely to be issues with translating a technical brochure, especially trying to accurately translate technical terms and idioms, and particularly challenging in a language like Spanish, where there are a variety of dialects with slightly different types of wording. And then number 2, what's sort of a outcome of this? Well, do perceptions of English and Spanish rip currents, English and Spanish speakers vary based on the rip current brochure? So the idea being that because the translation is coming from English then to Spanish, Spanish speakers might raise more issues with the brochure because the translation will have some imprecisions and things that just don't translate very well. So pretty straightforward, hopefully. Methodology was we were surveying this past summer in July and August of 22 in Queens and Nassau counties, and we went to some local community sites and surveyed individuals using a Qualtrics survey on an iPad, and the image on the right shows an example of one of my student research assistants surveying a community member. To make sure that we reached the community, we partnered with some civic associations. So we partnered with the Long Beach Latino Civic Association. Long Beach is a city of about 30,000 on the south shore of Long Island, on a barrier island. So surrounded by a bay on one side and the Atlantic Ocean. The other side's on the south shore of Long Island. So indeed, a place where there's much rip current risk because its beaches are right on the Atlantic Ocean. And there's a fairly substantial population that speaks Spanish in that community. And again, they're represented by the Long Beach Civic Association, who we partnered with to attend the weekly farmers market in town and survey those who spoke Spanish as the primary language. We also went to some senior centers in Queens County, part of New York City, also a place that has beaches on the Atlantic Ocean, primarily via Rockaways, which is the Barrier Island extension into the Queens County political geography. And we partnered with the New York State Office of Emergency Management to sort of piggyback on some of their outreach events that summer, mainly at senior centers in Queens. And then we surveyed some attendees there. And finally, we had a convenient sample of folks at Hofstra University. There are many employees and students that primarily speak Spanish. So we spoke with those individuals on campus, which is on Long Island as well, of course, so not too far from beaches where rip currents are frequent. We want to survey individuals in both languages to be able to compare English and Spanish speakers, our second research question, but we did want to have a bit more in the way of Spanish individuals, since that was a primary goal of this research, to better understand how the Spanish translation is working so far. So we had 139 responses, and 97 of them were done in Spanish, 42 in English. And survey takers, we gave them the option to do the survey in English or Spanish, whichever language most comfortable with. So of course, the English survey, they answered everything in English, looked at the English version of the brochure, and the Spanish survey takers looked at the Spanish brochure, then answered everything in Spanish. And I do not speak Spanish quite well myself, but I had two student research assistants who are both bilingual, and they assisted with translating the survey, both initially and then translating the responses. And of course, interfacing with folks that we surveyed who did not speak English very well. So components of the survey, we asked for some basic demographic information and language competencies. Very importantly, asked about beach visit frequency. And then we asked some sort of initial questions on past rip current experience and perceptions. And we have not had a chance to sort of do all the analysis yet, but sort of the point of this middle bullet point here was we wanted to sort of do a pre and post survey sort of notion of saying, okay, what are people's perceptions of rip currents initially? Then after look at this brochure, does that change the perception at all? And is it perhaps more impactful on the English side because that's sort of a cleaner translation? We asked several questions about the brochure and people's opinions on, again, this two-page rip current outreach brochure, how would it convey rip current danger and the likelihood to be caught in one. And a really key question, does the term rip current make sense as presented? And this is especially important when you think about the Spanish translation of that term, which is not the most elegant, which sections are most and least helpful. And then again, the sort of pre and post idea of like, now that you've read this brochure, can you tell me what do you do to escape a rip current? So kind of like real-time feedback on did this brochure actually do what it's intending to do and convey properly what to do in a rip current, which is, of course, a little more complicated than sort of the intuitive thing, which is to swim back to shore. So to sort of give you a flavor, here's what one side of the brochure looked like. And this also is sort of a very important part of the survey is we had individuals in the survey just tap on the iPad parts of the brochure that were one, most helpful to them, and then in the next question were least helpful or most unclear. To really give us a good objective sense of what's working on the brochure and what's not working. And then of course, to do a comparison, maybe it's different in terms of the Spanish and English versions of the brochure. And sort of to bury the lead here, but sort of the most impactful part of the survey has been just straight up the Spanish translation of the term rip current. And I know this is already people are aware of this in the NWS well before my own research, but this is of course the Spanish language version of the brochure. And sort of the big headline here is on the bottom right part of the brochure boxed in. We see here the translation to Spanish of rip current, which is corrientes de resaca. And immediately this was flagged by many Spanish language survey takers. Corrientes de resaca sort of literally was supposed to translate corriente, current, and resaca, rip. But however, in many dialects of Spanish, the term resaca actually means hangover to people. So as you can imagine, this was severely problematic that sort of literally this translates for most people into hangover currents, which just totally does not get to the right message that the NWS is trying to get here with this brochure, and NOAA is trying to get with this brochure. And indeed, some folks sort of said, sort of casually after the survey, like, corrientes de resaca, again, resaca implying hangover. Is this like a don't drink and go to the beach sort of message going on here with the hangover term? So clearly a big issue. Another thing that was more subtle, but was pointed out by someone that was very poignant was you see here right in the middle of the brochure, there's this little cartoon of a lifeguard with this little blurb about the National Meteorological Program of NOAA and how this is associated with Sea Grant and all that. Well, this little cartoon here is somewhat a buff-looking white dude straight out of Baywatch, and maybe some cultural sensitivity. Maybe just changing this to an individual that looks more like the average Spanish speaker. Of course, it's very complex. Lots of different people speak Spanish and look very differently, but certainly this caricature here is maybe not the most relatable for the average person reading this brochure. So that was flagged by someone I found to be a pointed comment as well. So just sort of immediately these issues that just with a few seconds looking at the brochure, many survey takers immediately brought to our attention being problematic aspects of this translated brochure. In terms of the demographics of those taking the survey, at the end of the day, only 139 respondents, so certainly don't want to make claims that this is totally representative of Spanish speakers in New York City and Long Island. There's some skew towards younger individuals, but it's a bit bifurcated because we did get to some older individuals in Queens County working with New York Emergency Management at some senior centers. But overall, a bit of a younger skew, more female than male. And most people took the survey in their first language, which is what we preferred. We didn't necessarily have people that were frequent beach visitors. Most people said they visited occasionally or rarely the ocean, so that's like once a week or once or twice a month. But as we know, that's actually sort of a very important demographic to get at because oftentimes with rip currents, it's less experienced swimmers and beachgoers that are most at danger of rip currents. So kind of people that go only occasionally or rarely is maybe kind of the perfect demographic to be outreaching towards. And we sort of start getting into the fact that this rip current outreach might not be working as well in Spanish. So 81% of English speakers reported hearing the term rip current before, only 70% in Spanish. Right there we see a pretty big gap. And in terms of whether you're an English or a Spanish speaker, most people have not been caught in rip current before. Fewer than 20% responded to being caught in one. Of course, this is self-reporting and imprecise, so it's possible that more people have been actually caught in rip current, they just didn't really realize. But of course, it's self-reporting, so hard to know for sure. Getting to some survey results. So we asked many opinion questions about the brochure. And one result that does stand out is while we expected maybe that, because the translation to Spanish has some issues, maybe the Spanish language brochure is not working as well. But in terms of these 2 points here, first of all, we see sort of coming in at the very beginning of the survey, we asked, how dangerous a rip current, how likely are to be caught in rip current. There's no significant difference between the English and Spanish speakers. So sort of everyone universally seems to have similar perceptions of rip currents coming in. And then after the survey, we asked, well, how likely does the brochure make you think you'd be caught in a rip current? And again, no significant difference between English and Spanish speakers. So in terms of just sort of very broad messaging of how likely is one to be caught in a rip current, perhaps these two samples are pretty similar. But then when you get into the important aspect of the brochure, how well is it messaging what to do in a rip current, that is then when maybe we see some issues in the Spanish language brochure, which I'll get to in a moment. But one other key point to make is I didn't pull the exact numbers, but very few, less than 20% had seen the full brochure before, but more had at least reported seeing similar signs at the beach, maybe just one of the infographics from the brochure, maybe something put out by a local municipality or life-saving association. I think this last point is important. I know the brochure maybe isn't meant for like widespread public use and consumption, but certainly very few people are sort of seeing it out in the wild, for lack of better words. So certainly, continuing to emphasize outreach efforts just in all languages for rip currents is important. Maybe more people will be exposed to this literature. That's really helpful. So again, big issue with the term rip current, and the big headline is Resaca means hangover to a lot of people. And I know that having met with Nelson and Dave and the Spanish language translation folks back a few months ago, that I know AWS is kind of tied to a certain style of translation, but if you do just type Resaca into Google, it comes up as hangover for their translation. So certainly there is a lot of sort of support here, both from the survey and just in general that when you have current instead of Osaka might mean hangover to most people reading it. And especially tilted to certain dialects of Spanish, certain generations. It seemed like maybe, again, small sample size, but in our survey, the younger folks were more likely to associate Osaka with hangover, of course, problematic. And sort of working backwards to the top point on the slide, this does have sort of a real consequence that we asked a question, after reading this brochure, does the term rip current as it's used in this brochure make sense to you? And there's a significant difference between the English speakers and the Spanish speakers. So Spanish speakers were significantly more likely to say that no, rip current does not make sense to us. And I think we could all agree if just the term rip current isn't making sense, there's a lower likelihood that the rest of the brochure will get buy-in from people if just the general term isn't translating well. I know this is not necessarily due binding with rip current and with other severe weather types as well. And importantly, participants were asked to suggest alternative terms for rip currents. And in English language, very few suggestions. But given the tough translation to Spanish, many Spanish responses to the survey had some suggestions for alternative terms, and there are a variety of them. But the most common one with 6 responses, so 6 of the 97 individuals taking the survey said corrientes peligrosas, so dangerous currents essentially would be a better translation. So you don't therefore have the problem with the hangover translation. So certainly I think some merit should be given to thinking about, maybe making it a more general translation, dangerous current, instead of trying to be so precise with something that's a bit more idiomatic, rip current, which makes sense in English, but clearly not as much in other languages. In terms of the brochure, text and graphics, a variety of graphics in there, and some are more helpful than others. So, for example, for both languages, participants found this bird's eye view graphic of a rip current to be confusing. And I think we as meteorologists, perhaps, we see this plume, it makes sense to us, but maybe to the general public, that bird's eye view is just not super helpful. And I'm not critiquing here. I know it's super challenging to convey rip current danger in particular. Most people don't really see a rip current because they're not looking at the beach from an aerial view or not doing what's recommended and sort of going up on a dune or up on the boardwalk and sort of looking down on the beach at elevation to sort of see the rip currents. Very few people do that besides lifeguards. So therefore, it's just not going to be very relatable putting pictures of rip currents in the various forms, but just reporting the fact that many people found this to be unhelpful. And also, I know it's a little bit small, but in the Spanish captioning here for this image is pluma, the sediment plume translation. Apparently that did not translate very well into Spanish either. So further adding confusion, the photo being unclear, is then also the caption not really translating very well. And then, of course, Spanish speakers in particular flagged some of the phrases being unhelpful. And of course, we like calls to action, and calls to action are great. There's a ton of research showing that they're helpful. Turn around, don't drown, break the grip of the rip. But break the grip of the rip, as we know, when we translate it to Spanish, it's an idiom, so it's a problem, or any other language. And also we lose the rhyming aspect. So it just becomes maybe more of a liability than a help when you have this idiom that doesn't translate very well and loses sort of the rhyming catchiness to it. And to sort of really help to quantify these aspects of the brochure that are flagged as unhelpful, I know this is a bit busy, but we were able to generate Qualtrics survey software. It's really incredible. And they're able to generate automatically heat maps showing which parts of the brochure were helpful and which were more unhelpful. So this is first, again, 2 separate surveys, Spanish and English. These are the results of the Spanish survey. The left half is a heat map of which aspects of the brochure were tapped by people as being helpful in messaging. And on the right half of the slide, which aspects of the brochure were flagged as being unclear and not helpful. So we see on the left, clearly this infographic, the Know Your Options infographic, which again is sometimes a standalone posting on a beach or on a bulletin board, was probably the most helpful aspect of the brochure, which is really good to see because that's a really great graphic, I think. And you see Spanish speakers, despite the issues with the translation of rip current, found this to be really useful. There's some key bullet points. It's a pretty intuitive graphic. And it's, quite clear overall. Also, this image showing what a rip current looks like sort of from the beach view was shown to be pretty helpful since that's perhaps a more relatable sort of image in a full-on aerial view. But in general, there is certainly a push for more of the graphics being shown to be helpful for Spanish speakers. So I would caution and say, maybe people are just, going to the graphics because they found the text to be confusing. Maybe the graphics aren't super helpful, just it's more helpful in relation to the translation in the text that was confusing or unclear to a lot of people. And that sort of evidence on the right here, we see what was most unclear to people in the graphics. And note that for helpful, we asked people to tap 3 things that were helpful. For unclear, we asked people to tap just 1 thing. So you're going to see sort of less coloring here because there are fewer sample points. But notice what clearly stands out and what was unclear in the brochure. The term Resaca right on the front of the brochure here is by far the top thing that was marked as unclear. So we sort of got from both informal feedback, from our text-based feedback and sort of the short answer questions that Resaca was confusing. And finally, we have this more qualitative evidence that this heat map clearly highlights the term Resaca is confusing. So a lot of evidence here that this translation, if at all possible, maybe needs to be shifted. So a lot of different points of evidence for this. And finally, moving on to now the English heat map, same thing on the left showing what was helpful, on the right what was unclear. Note that the English sample is just much smaller overall, so perhaps not as useful, the findings here, but important to note that, again, the rip currents know your options graphics was flagged as helpful. Especially right in the middle of the graphic, both English and Spanish speakers tap right in the middle, maybe showing that this entire graphic is really clear and helpful. So certainly something to emphasize. And for the unclear, really not much can be said because there weren't that many samples and they're kind of all over the place, which sort of further shows that sort of systematically with the Spanish brochure, this clear issue with the translation, especially the rip current term translation, English working better overall, and just not as sort of comprehensive of one aspect that was shown to be unclear. Okay, so again, just wrapping this up with some takeaways. Definitely for the Spanish speakers, the graphics are rated to be most helpful. We also had some follow-up questions, short answer questions to explain why you chose these things to be helpful, explain why you chose these things to be not helpful, unclear. So again, Spanish speakers emphasize that the graphics are rated most helpful, but again, we do caution is that a factor of just the graphics being effective, or maybe also the text was poorly translated, at least the graphics were not hampered by that as much. English speakers had minimal advice for improvements, so it's working pretty well seemingly in the English language, but again, Spanish speakers had many more issues that they brought up, primarily translation issues. And again, that know your options infographic, both languages working really well. And again, we know that's sometimes a standalone graphic out there, so clearly that's working pretty well. Started doing and getting towards the wrap up here. In the midst of some more categorization of qualitative response, we had a variety of short answer questions in the survey, trying to do some content analysis to sort of categorize them into common categories to make sense of what people are saying. So for example, we had a Likert scale question, so scale of 1 to 5. How dangerous did the brochure make you think a rip current is? So people answer that Likert scale question. Then it had a follow-up short answer question. What informed your response to that question? So in both Spanish and English, we see among the most responses said that information from the pamphlet helped to inform my response here. But notice that almost twice as many in terms of percentage, English respondents cited the pamphlet as sort of shaping their opinion of a rip current danger than Spanish respondents. This is sort of more quantitative evidence now that the pamphlet is more impactful on English speakers and less impactful on Spanish speakers. After reading through the pamphlet, Spanish speakers are more split on sort of what's informing their opinion of rip current danger. Some people saying info from the pamphlet, but also some people just a general risk of death or drowning that maybe they already knew about. Some people citing prior experience and knowledge, or still not having a lot of knowledge. Whereas for the English respondents, more people said the pamphlet really informed their response here. So clearly, this is sort of maybe a convoluted way of saying that the brochure is more impactful on English speakers than Spanish speakers, which further provides evidence that the translation into Spanish needs some work. So I know I've said a lot of this already, but just to sort of wrap up into some key discussion points. Sort of some quantitative responses show that the brochure is conveying rip current danger and likelihood equally for both languages. Other responses, not so much. And there's definitely some general issues. First, for both languages, it's cited that there's too much jargon and technical photos. And also a point I didn't really get to too much here, but is noted in previous work that I've done with the virtual reality simulation of a rip current and seeing what people actually do when caught in one in a video game, that swimming parallel to shore is just not the most memorable lesson. Yelling for help, asking for help seems to be sort of what people glom onto when we ask them, what would you do in a rip current, even after getting like an intervention like a brochure. So that's just sort of in the background here. And overall, Spanish participants noting several limitations with the translation of the brochure. The term rip current itself, again, very important that it doesn't seem to translate well for a lot of people. Break the grip of the rip call to action doesn't work. And ultimately, this does, in some metrics of the survey, show that the brochure's effectiveness is not working as well in languages other than English. Also, some other issues came up with the Spanish language translation. Grammatical errors were noted, apparently, sort of a mix between the formal and informal being used, usted and to. Also, had feedback from some individuals that sort of the brochure was translated into the more formal Spaniard dialect of Spanish, but perhaps in the New York area and maybe in the entire US, more individuals speak Latin American Spanish based on where they're from. So perhaps it should be in the Latin American Spanish translation. And I also talked a while with my research assistant about this, who is bilingual and speaks Latin American Spanish. And I know spoke with a lot of survey takers about that. Also, one other thing that came up was there's a link on the brochure to the sort of NWS Rip Current Toolkit webpage. But even on the Spanish brochure, it still links to an English webpage. So then that kind of maybe cuts off the ability to get more information for interested parties. And finally, again, jargon just doesn't translate well at all. We know this. I just want to convey the fact that having the rhyming call to action works well in English, but doesn't translate. And also it's an idiom that doesn't work well. When it does work, though, it works. So the Know Your Options section was highlighted as being helpful in both languages, and then lots of survey responses to reflect on the fact that that aspect of the brochure was helpful in framing decision-making. Okay, so future work. Previously was funded by New York Sea Grant to develop a English language virtual reality simulation of a rip current. And we went to the beaches on Long Island in the summer of 2019 to sort of test out that simulation. And it really showed promise in the idea that just handing someone a static brochure for what to do in a rip current is not the most impactful, but if they put on a virtual reality headset and actually sort of experience one in an immersive setting, it's more memorable in terms of what they should do, because they actually physically do in the simulation take action. They try to wait for help or swim out of the rip current. So circling back to that now, we are in the process of translating this virtual reality experience into Spanish to then test in the fall as to whether that is another perhaps more viable means of conveying rip current information and outreach in languages other than English. And of course, this framework should be applied to other weather hazards, and snow squalls, especially here in the Eastern region talk, seems to be a prime candidate for a couple of these studies. One, a VR simulation of a snow squall will be awesome, and really very important in sort of showing people what to do when you're driving and need to slow down. And two, I'm really not aware of how much translation info has been done on snow squalls, but certainly these sorts of aspects should be considered. And whenever there is like a catchphrase for snow squalls developed, ideally that translates well into other languages if at all possible to sort of make the messaging more universal. All right, just a host of acknowledgements to make. This work is being funded by New York Sea Grant. Have a variety of partners on this, New York Sea Grant staff. Co-PIs are Nelson and Dave from OKX, Greg Dusek from the National Ocean Service. Have folks from FEMA as well. Hofstra research assistants that have been super helpful, and our two local associations that helped us with the survey. All right, thank you for your time and attention on this. If there's time left, I'm happy to take some questions, and also feel free to reach out via email or social media. So thanks again for attending the talk today.
Thank you so much, Jase. Really appreciate all this great information this morning. I have a question of my own, a couple of comments, but I'll start off with Mr. Riddell. Go ahead.
No, you can go first, Jordan. It's okay. Go ahead.
Okay. So first of all, where to start? There is so much great information presented here. One of my comments, you highlighted the issues about the translation issues in going to the level of specificity to various wording. One thing I'll be curious of, and that may actually be fruitful from your research you said coming this summer or fall.
Oh yeah, later in the year.
Yeah, later this year. Having the direct experience of their reaction and how they interpret a rip current may also speak to part of the wording issues. I've had some experience with Spanish. Translation is a pain. There's no getting around that. But sometimes the more simplicity you have, the better, because like you said, the wording can be very challenging. As far as, and I actually like the comment about the corrientes peligros that you mentioned, because sometimes some more simpler explanation is better. Another thing you mentioned at the end about expanding this effort to other weather phenomena, definitely keep in touch with us as well about that, because there's a lot of research at a national level going on in the winter weather program about the expansion of communication of the dangers of snow squalls as well. So be interested to see where you may end up going with that as far as future work, because we've had recent webinars on that as well in Eastern region. But this is not just an Eastern region issue. This is a national issue. So that will be great as well. Those are the things I wanted to mention initially. If I think of more, I'll add. Dave, go ahead.
Thanks, Jordan.
Yeah, one comment, Jason, and one question. The comment is, I think, we've sort of talked locally about when we get into later in the spring here and we start doing some of the, social media messaging and when we have Beach Hazard Week and those sorts of things, trying to integrate some of the work here in that vein. The one question I had, and I'm not sure why I didn't ask this before, but if you go back to your slide talking about the upcoming VR piece, what's the approach there? Do you take what you've learned from this study and then change the terminology to what you have found based on the surveys, or do you keep the terminology similar to what the kind of official outreach materials are now? What's the approach there?
That's a great and open question, and that we should definitely chat more about. And I'm not sure what the best answer is. Certainly, sort of sticking with the official terminology would sort of be consistent with the initial survey and could lead to a more direct comparison. But then on the other hand, it's like we're using this language that we know is kind of flawed. So is that going to yield the best results? I think that's a really important point to think about. And thanks for raising that.
Okay, now it's interesting, and I don't have a strong thought on it either way, but that was the first thing I was thinking of when you were mentioning that. So that's great. Thanks.
Definitely. Thanks. And just Jordan, to your point on the sort of the same similar question or comment with which terminology should be used and using more simple things. Certainly the dangerous currents translation seems to have sort of universal currency among a lot of Spanish-speaking survey takers. Again, I know a small sample, but seemed promising. And also, again, that know your options graphic was pretty simple and didn't have much jargon. So that was, again, flag is really good, but I think that's an important point too.
Yeah, I have an additional thought. I will hold that. I'll give Nelson the floor first.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. Now, I just wanted to kind of piggyback off of what Dave was saying. But in terms of like some of the, I think the findings from this, I think having Greg Dusek from NOS, like he's really been doing a lot in terms of leading, the rip current safety messaging, and I think even he's probably had a good hand in terms of how the brochure is developed. So I think that in turn, I think he's the right person in terms of maybe at least the NOAA approach of improving the communication. I think getting the United States Life Saving Association involved, or like kind of sharing some of this, I think sharing the findings with them, I think that would be big. And I know locally we have, with New York Sea Grant, we have our, rip current network kind of partnership. So I think, locally kind of sharing this, and then also I think that because the USLA, they would be good just in terms of, they have presence out in the West Coast, and I'm sure, West Coast, Southern, Gulf regions, Miami, South Texas, a lot of areas that I think kind of getting feedback or even kind of expanding this survey to those areas and kind of getting feedback, because I think you're talking about like just the Spanish dialects, some of the challenges we have from different parts of the country, and even Puerto Rico versus Castilian Spanish and things like that. So, but with that also, with that challenge, I think that's why we want definitely would like to kind of keep you in the loop in terms of what we're doing with the national kind of Spanish language translation movement, because they are, they're starting with a kind of a Castilian approach to translations, and kind of more for short fuse warnings. But I think this is a really good one that we can wrap up and into that as well. And this is they're kind of using machine learning, AI techniques, and then I guess human kind of checking and kind of I think feedback to kind of improve things. So I think we have like kind of different routes, and so Dave and I think we can kind of see where we can steer this and share this feedback. But I definitely see the possibilities of expanding this and getting kind of more universal feedback to kind of help the process kind of back up with Greg and NWS in terms of improving the kind of the rip current brochures and just the messaging for Spanish. So, but always appreciate your work, Jase.
Thank you, Nelson, for all the support over the years. It's been such a great partnership. And yes, I know this very small, limited survey is not necessarily grounds for making radical changes, but in an ideal world, something similar to this, really should be spread, across the country and elicit thousands of responses and give us a really comprehensive sense of what are the best changes that can be made, and recognizing the complexity of the different dialects and whatnot. I know it's not an easy answer.
All right, thank you for that, Nelson, for that input as well. Really appreciate it. The only other thing I was going to add was sort of piggybacking off of what Nelson brought up about looking at this from a broader perspective, especially when it comes to looking at different parts of the country, whether it's like Texas or parts of the Gulf Coast or the Northeast. And granted, I understand that this is a broader work effort that would be involved, but looking at the translation variability that can occur sometimes with even something as simple as the words rip current together can vary a bit. Now, I will also say, depending upon the way it's phrased, the way it's translated, you may or may not end up needing to have a variable, like let's say the worst case scenario would be the concept of multiple documents categorizing different translations, which is ideally not the way you want to go if you don't have to, and you may not have to, but clarifying the graphics translation is also just as important, like you noted, because if you're translating what a graphic means, that the explanation, like the phrase "picture's worth 1,000 words," and that can really speak to the support. But like I'll go back to my original point earlier in the discussion here, that when you have that additional opportunity to speak with people later this year in person, that you're going to likely get some input on those pieces, even by virtue of them experiencing this VR simulation of this. Now, I was going to actually ask you about that in particular. So when they're going through the simulation, are you in the water? Are you going? And the reason I'm asking this is, what's the depth of the simulation itself? What are they experiencing? I'm just curious.
So the simulation is right there. They're swimming in the ocean. And it's very video game like, of course, but yeah, it's very immersive. There's the sounds of the ocean and the splashing, of your arms in the water, and yeah, so it's really fully fairly realistic in that sense. And they sort of learn how to swim, use a joystick controller to swim and wave their arm by pushing a button, and then they're it's sort of meant to be kind of tricky, and it just says, okay, all of a sudden you're being pulled away from shore. What do you do essentially? So sort of meant to emulate the fact that a rip current doesn't advertise itself as a rip current; it just starts pulling you from shore, and then you need to make a decision. Of course, that panic of being pulled from shore sometimes compels people to fight it and potentially drown.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you for that. I don't have any additional questions. I guess I know smaller audience this morning, but any additional questions from folks out there virtually at this point? Okay, if not, Jase, really thank you so much again for being with us this morning. Ahead of also congratulations on upcoming leave. So wishing you the best with that, and looking forward. Let's keep in touch as well, moving forward on other initiatives you're working on. And I guess with that said, we'll wrap this up. Again, it's been recorded as a reminder. So at the conclusion, by later today, tomorrow, we'll aim to get this up on our Google site. Thank you again for all that are attending now and those that listen later. And wishing you all a great rest of your Thursday. Thank you so much.